Mara stands alone in the empty swimming pool of an old sports center, her footsteps echoing against the tiled walls as she looks up at the faded ceiling. And she feels a quiet sense of disorientation, as if her life has been drained of something essential without her fully noticing when it happened. And she thinks about how once she measured herself by intensity, by ambition, by emotional extremes, believing that feeling deeply meant living fully. But over time, those sharp edges softened into routines, compromises, and emotional distance she learned to call maturity. And she reflects on how often she chose safety over honesty, how she silenced her instincts for the sake of stability, how she adopted her personality to environments that never truly reflected her inner world. And as she traces the cracks in the empty pool with her fingers, she realizes that her current emptiness is not sudden. It is the result of gradual emotional withdrawal, a slow retreat from vulnerability disguised as growth. And in this strange stillness, she becomes aware that what she misses is not excitement, not chaos, not youth, but authenticity, the feeling of being emotionally engaged with her own experience instead of observing it from a distance. And she understands that the most difficult transformation ahead is not external reinvention, but internal reanimation, the willingness to feel again without control, without filters, without the protective numbness she learned to mistake for peace. Mara sits alone in her car, parked outside the closed sports center, the engine already off, but her hands still resting on the steering wheel. And she feels a strange resistance to leaving, as if stepping back into the world will require energy she no longer knows how to access. And she reflects on how exhaustion can exist even without visible struggle, how emotional fatigue builds not from trauma or chaos, but from years of quiet self-suppression, of adapting, of becoming manageable instead of real. And she thinks about how often she edited her reactions, her desires, her tone of voice, learning to stay calm, reasonable, low maintenance, until even her internal world began to feel muted and distant. And as she watches her own reflection in the dark windshield, she becomes aware that her current numbness is not a lack of emotion, but a defense against feeling too much, a learned strategy to avoid disappointment, attachment, and vulnerability. And this awareness feels unsettling because it reveals how deeply she internalized the idea that emotional intensity is dangerous, that caring too deeply leads to loss, instability, or pain. And so she gradually trained herself to remain detached, composed, self-contained, mistaking emotional distance for strength. And now, sitting in this silence, she senses a quiet grief for the parts of herself she restrained, the curiosity she subdued, the impulses she dismissed, not because they were wrong, but because they felt risky. And she understands that reawakening emotionally will not feel safe or comfortable. It will feel exposed, uncertain, and fragile. But she also realizes that remaining numb is not neutral. It is a slow form of disappearance, a life experienced at a distance. And in this recognition, she feels a subtle but powerful tension between protection and presence, between the safety of emotional control and the unpredictable intensity of being fully alive again. Mara walks slowly through her apartment, touching familiar objects as if she's seeing them for the first time. The couch where she spends evenings scrolling without focus, the bookshelf filled with titles she once intended to read but never opened, the framed photos capturing versions of herself that now feel distant and symbolic rather than emotionally real. And she reflects on how easily life can become a collection of surfaces, organized, functional, aesthetically acceptable, but internally disconnected. And she realizes that her environment mirrors her emotional state, carefully curated but quietly empty. And she thinks about how much energy she invested in appearing composed, stable, and self-sufficient, how rarely she allowed herself to express confusion, longing, or dissatisfaction, because those emotions felt inconvenient, disruptive, or immature. And as she sits on the floor surrounded by these silent objects, she becomes aware that her emotional withdrawal was not intentional. It was gradual, a slow accumulation of small self-denials that taught her to prioritize control over experience. And this realization feels deeply uncomfortable because it reveals that nothing external is truly missing. The absence she feels exists entirely within, a disconnect between her lived reality and her internal emotional presence. And she understands that healing will not mean acquiring new things, new relationships, or new goals, but relearning how to feel without immediately managing, interpreting, or minimizing her own responses, allowing emotion to exist without justification, without resolution, without fear, and accepting that vulnerability is not weakness, but the only pathway back to authenticity. Mara sits on the edge of her bed late at night, the room illuminated only by the soft glow of a lamp, and she feels a quiet unease that has nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with awareness. The slow recognition that she has been emotionally absent from her own life for longer than she can remember. And she reflects on how often she chose emotional neutrality as a form of safety, how she learned to respond instead of initiate, to observe instead of participate, to keep her inner world private and controlled because unpredictability once felt dangerous. And she thinks about the relationships she maintained at a comfortable distance, never asking for too much, never revealing too much, never allowing herself to need or be needed. And this pattern now feels less like independence and more like emotional self-erasure, a subtle refusal to engage fully with anything that might destabilize her carefully constructed calm. And as she listens to the quiet sounds of the building around her, strangers living parallel lives behind thin walls, she feels a strange loneliness, not from isolation, but from self-disconnection, the sense of being present everywhere except within herself. And she understands that her exhaustion does not come from doing too much, but from holding back constantly, from the effort of staying contained, composed, emotionally regulated at all times. And this realization feels both heavy and clarifying, because it suggests that what she truly needs is not rest, not escape, not reinvention, but permission. Permission to feel without controlling the outcome, to express without editing, to exist without protecting herself from every possible emotional risk, and to accept that the only way to return to herself is to step into the very vulnerability she spent years avoiding. Mara stands under the running shower, letting the water cover her face as if it might wash away the heaviness she can't name. And she feels a quiet emotional release, not in the form of tears, but in the subtle collapse of resistance. The moment when she stops trying to understand, manage, or explain what she feels, and simply allows it to exist. And she reflects on how deeply she internalized the belief that emotions must always be justified, productive, or useful, that feeling without direction was a sign of weakness, confusion, or instability. And she realizes how this mindset taught her to intellectualize everything, to analyze pain instead of experiencing it, to describe longing instead of admitting it, to conceptualize dissatisfaction instead of feeling it directly. And as the water continues to fall, she senses the emotional tension in her body, the tightness in her chest, the shallow breathing, the subtle habits of self-protection she carries even in solitude. And she becomes aware that her numbness was not an absence of feeling, but a refusal to feel without control, a fear that if she truly allowed emotion to surface, it might overwhelm her, destabilize her, expose parts of herself she learned to hide. And this realization feels both frightening and relieving, because it reveals that what she needs is not to become stronger, more disciplined, or more composed, but to become softer, more open, more willing to exist in emotional uncertainty. And she understands that healing will not look like fixing herself, but like unlearning the need to fix at all, learning instead how to trust her own emotional rhythms without trying to dominate them, explain them, or turn them into something manageable. Mara walks through a crowded street in the late afternoon, surrounded by conversations, laughter, and the restless movement of people going somewhere, and she feels strangely invisible, not because no one sees her, but because she no longer feels fully present inside her own body, as if she is observing life through a transparent barrier. And she reflects on how often she learned to perform emotional stability, smiling when expected, reacting appropriately, maintaining composure even when something inside her felt unresolved. And she realizes how this constant self-regulation slowly created a distance between her internal experience and her external expression, teaching her to live in translation rather than truth. And as she watches strangers pass by, each carrying their own invisible emotional narratives, she becomes aware that connection feels difficult not because she lacks opportunities, but because she has trained herself to remain emotionally unavailable, to keep interactions safe, light, and controlled, avoiding depth not out of disinterest, but out of fear of what might surface if she allowed herself to be truly seen. And this awareness feels unsettling because it reveals that loneliness is not about absence, it is about inhibition, the inability to let yourself be affected by others or affect them in return. And she understands now that reclaiming emotional presence will require her to abandon the illusion of control, to risk awkwardness, misunderstanding, and vulnerability, and to accept that emotional exposure is not a threat to her stability, but the very condition for feeling real again. Mara sits on the floor of her living room with the lights turned off, the city glow filtering faintly through the window, and she feels a deep internal quiet that is not peaceful but revealing, the kind of silence that makes it impossible to avoid your own thoughts. And she begins to recognize how much of her identity was constructed around being emotionally easy, adaptable, undemanding, someone who never required too much space, too much attention, or too much emotional energy. And she reflects on how often she minimized her needs to avoid conflict, how she learned to accept less connection than she desired because asking for more felt uncomfortable, excessive, or risky. And she realizes that this habit slowly taught her to disappear emotionally, even while remaining physically present, to become someone who listens more than speaks, accommodates more than expresses, and observes more than participates. And as she sits in this darkness, she feels a quiet grief for the parts of herself that were never allowed to take up space, the emotions that were postponed, the desires that were never articulated. And this grief feels unfamiliar because it is not dramatic, it is slow, reflective, and honest. And she understands now that self-abandonment does not always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like politeness, patience, and emotional restraint. And that reclaiming herself will require not force or reinvention, but permission. The permission to be inconvenient, uncertain, emotionally visible, and imperfect, and to accept that authenticity will sometimes cost comfort, approval, and control, but will finally allow her to exist fully rather than quietly. Mara stands in the doorway of her apartment with her coat still on, keys in her hand, unsure whether she is leaving or arriving, and this hesitation feels symbolic, as if her entire emotional life exists in this suspended state between movement and stillness. And she reflects on how often she acted out of obligation rather than desire, saying yes because it was expected, staying because it was easier, adapting because resistance felt exhausting. And she realizes that over time, this created a life that feels coherent on the outside, but fragmented internally, a sequence of reasonable decisions that never quite aligned with what she actually felt. And as she looks around the room, familiar but emotionally distant, she becomes aware that her greatest fear is not being alone, but being fully present. Because presence removes excuses, removes narratives, removes the protective layer of busyness and responsibility, and forces her to confront what she actually wants without external justification. And this awareness feels deeply destabilizing because it reveals that much of her emotional numbness was a strategy, a way to avoid disappointment by lowering expectation, a way to avoid vulnerability by reducing attachment. And now, standing in this threshold, she feels the quiet tension between safety and truth, between remaining emotionally contained and allowing herself to want something again without knowing if it will be fulfilled. And she understands that this moment is not about making a decision, but about recognizing a pattern, the lifelong habit of staying just distant enough from her own desires to avoid risk. And she senses that the real transformation ahead will not come from changing her environment, her relationships, or her circumstances, but from changing her internal posture, from learning how to remain emotionally open even when uncertainty feels uncomfortable, even when longing feels dangerous, and even when the outcome cannot be controlled. Mara stands barefoot in the kitchen as the first light of morning filters through the blinds, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. And she feels an unfamiliar sense of presence, not clarity, not certainty, but a subtle awareness of herself occupying space without distraction. And she reflects on how often she treated her own emotions as something to manage rather than experience, how she learned to stay composed, reasonable, emotionally neutral, because intensity once felt dangerous, inconvenient, or too much. And she realizes now that this lifelong self-regulation did not protect her from pain. It only protected her from depth, from attachment, from the unpredictable reality of being fully alive. And as she rests her hands on the cold counter, she senses how deeply she internalized the belief that wanting more was selfish, that needing connection was weakness, that emotional expression required justification. And this recognition feels quietly devastating, because it reveals how much of her life was shaped by absence rather than choice, by avoidance rather than intention. And yet, within this awareness, she does not feel urgency to change anything externally. She feels something more fragile and more honest, the willingness to remain with herself without controlling the outcome, without suppressing discomfort, without retreating into numbness. And she understands that the most radical shift she can make is not a new direction, but a new relationship with her own inner world, one based not on discipline or restraint, but on attention, curiosity, and the courage to stay emotionally present even when nothing feels resolved.